Ma'am, were you crying when you were shooting him?
I don't remember.
Were you crying when you were stabbing him?
I don't remember.
How about when you cut his throat? Were you crying then?
I don't know.
A text message can't kill someone, but it can push them closer to the edge. In Michelle Carter's case, words alone became the weapon through thousands of messages with her boyfriend. She blurred the line between love and manipulation. When he followed her final command, prosecutors faced an unprecedented question: can digital influence become manslaughter? This isn't just a courtroom story, it's a moral reckoning for the online age. Jodi Arias and the performance of innocence. The courtroom lights are steady, the air is still. Yet on the witness stand, a woman stares ahead with unnerving calm. The same woman accused of planning, executing, and covering up a brutal killing. Jodi Arias, once seen as the picture of devotion, presented herself as polite, composed, and heartbreakingly misunderstood. But her composure wasn't innocence. It was performance. Jodi met Travis Alexander in the world of modern ambition. He worked in sales, confident and charismatic. She was magnetic, quick to mold herself into whatever he admired. Their romance unfolded through shared faith, secret trips, and photos meant to capture intimacy. But underneath that shiny facade was resentment, jealousy, and fear of being discarded. In June 2008, that tension would erupt behind the walls of Alexander's home in Mesa, Arizona. Investigators would later uncover a scene that defied the narrative Arias once told, one of romance and reconciliation. Police found his home transformed into a forensic map of violence. A camera recovered from the washing machine held deleted photos that charted minute by minute the moments before and during the murder. Digital forensics resurrected what she had tried to bury: timestamps, snapshots, and her presence in the room. When questioned, Arias denied everything. At first, she insisted she hadn't seen Travis in weeks. When confronted with photographic evidence, she shifted, claiming masked intruders had stormed the house, leaving her too terrified to speak. Later still, she declared it was self-defense, that she had been attacked, cornered, and forced to fight for her life. Each version collided violently with physical evidence. The story changed as often as the audience did. Prosecutors treated those contradictions as deliberate manipulation. Arizona law, specifically ARS 1311-05, defines premeditated first-degree murder as a killing done with intent or knowledge, proving conscious decision, not accident. For the jury, those digital details, a palm print and blood-deleted photos, and the recovery of the camera's memory card, built the spine of premeditation. The technology spoke when Arias would not. In court, her demeanor became its own study. She gave long, controlled answers, avoiding emotional collapse. Reporters noticed her effect, sometimes reflective, other times detached, as though she were watching a production, not reliving a killing. Jurors were asked to believe her stories of abuse, terror, and trauma. The prosecution invited them to see something else: a woman rewriting her own guilt, adjusting facts in real time. Every cross-examination stripped another layer from the image she'd cultivated. Her voice never cracked. Her gaze never fell under the Arizona Revised Statutes, Title 13. The charge carried the possibility of death. The stakes could not have been higher, and still her tone stayed measured. To many, that absence of visible remorse became its own kind of evidence. What kind of person could narrate such acts without trembling? Outside the courtroom, the media consumed every ounce of spectacle. Networks turned daily testimony into serialized drama interviews played on repeat, each one showing a slightly different version of Jodi Arias. She had answers for everything she flirted with. Cameras spoke of healing and smiled when describing her spiritual growth. The public response was divided between fascination and disgust. But to prosecutors, each appearance confirmed the same pattern: control, manipulation, and the need to dominate perception. By the time the verdict arrived, the nation had already formed its opinion. The jury found her guilty of first-degree murder, unanimously agreeing that the act was intentional and premeditated. But when faced with the question of life or death, they fractured, unable to agree on capital punishment. The court imposed life without the possibility of parole, ensuring she would never walk free again. For legal scholars and behavioral experts, the Arias case became more than a headline. It was a study in calculated deception, the intersection of psychology and performance, where guilt hides beneath poise. Her trial demonstrated how charisma, when weaponized, can distort truth long enough to challenge even the most seasoned investigators. To some, she remains the embodiment of manipulation, masquerading as sincerity. Every smile, every careful word revealed that composure can conceal savagery. The jury's verdict wasn't just a legal conclusion. It was an indictment of the performance itself. The illusion had collapsed, but the fascination endured, because manipulation doesn't always need a gun or a knife. Sometimes it begins with affection and evolves into dominance, so subtle it hides in plain sight. But manipulation takes many forms, not always with a weapon, sometimes with a message sent from a phone.
Has found that the Commonwealth has proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Ms. Carter's actions and also her failure.
Michelle Carter and the weight of words. What happens when manipulation hides in plain sight, not in a gunshot, but in a text thread? For the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, that question wasn't theoretical. It centered on Michelle Carter and her boyfriend Conrad Roy, two teenagers whose relationship existed mostly through their phones. They confided in each other about loneliness medication and the exhaustion of living with constant sadness. At first, their connection looked like mutual comfort, but messages that began as empathy turned into control. Carter encouraged Roy to talk about his depression, but gradually took command of the conversation. She reinforced his hopelessness, offering approval. When he described giving up to law enforcement, those exchanges became the foundation of a new kind of crime, one committed through digital words that urged a vulnerable person toward irreversible action. Prosecutors said her text functioned as a weapon of persuasion. The courtroom question became simple but radical: can language alone cause death under the law? Their private conversations were recovered from phones, each message time-stamped and preserved. Investigators traced a steady escalation, phrases affirming despair plans, disgust and approved reassurance repeated when he hesitated. Most chilling to jurors were the moments when Carter appeared to instruct rather than react. The words she sent that night would become the core of the prosecution's argument, suggesting premeditated emotional coercion rather than passive observation. The defense countered that words are protected speech, not criminal conduct. They argued she lacked physical involvement, that the state could not prove her messages directly caused death. Under Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 265, Section 13, involuntary manslaughter requires reckless or wanton behavior contributing to another's death. The case hinged on whether digital persuasion could meet that threshold. It was unprecedented. No prior case had ever extended criminal culpability into the private exchange of text between intimate partners. Prosecutors framed it differently. They told the court that influence, when sustained and intentional, can be as lethal as any physical act. They pointed to messages that seemed to remove his autonomy, replacing it with her command. Forensic analysts reconstructed the timeline, charting every message leading up to the final hours. Each bubble of text became a piece of forensic evidence, proof not of violence, but of compulsion. Emotion became the object of analysis and empathy. Itself became corrupted into pressure. When the communications were read aloud in court, the silence that followed was heavy. Jurors didn't see rage. They saw calculation. The language wasn't frantic or confused. It was calm, directive, often mimicking authority. It was that control, decisive and detached, that prosecutors said crossed the legal boundary into reckless indifference. Her defense maintained she only echoed his despair, that she too was unstable and lonely, still a child herself. But the state insisted her repetition of encouragement even after his doubts demonstrated intent. The trial divided public opinion. Many saw a teenager overwhelmed by mental illness, not a criminal mastermind. Others saw deliberate manipulation, sustained over weeks disguised as concern. Reporters described her demeanor as motionless. She sat at the defense table, her expression unreadable, often staring straight ahead, as witnesses read the most intimate details of her relationship. That blankness became a focal point. Was it shock or lack of remorse? Psychologists debated whether she acted from dependency or from the exhilaration of control. When the judge delivered the verdict, the courtroom remained still. Michelle Carter was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter under common law, principles of causation and recklessness. Her sentencing, 15 months of incarceration and subsequent probation, marked a precedent-setting moment. The court determined that her words, not her presence, constituted criminal negligence capable of causing death. For the first time, language itself was recognized as potential conduct in the eyes of the law. The aftermath reverberated far beyond Massachusetts. Legal scholars called it the first case to criminalize psychological manipulation detached from physical action. It forced jurists, legislators, and digital users to confront a harsh reality. Communication in the modern age carries new forms of risk, especially when one person's influence consumes another's will. The case closed a gap between moral and legal responsibility, defining a boundary for an era when relationships unfold through screens. Michelle Carter's conviction also reshaped how prosecutors viewed virtual coercion. Text once dismissed as casual communication gained evidentiary weight comparable to fingerprints or DNA. The ruling suggested that intent could live inside conversation, that tone and timing could function as a map of moral agency. For victims' advocates, it was a moment of accountability, the recognition that invisible violence still leaves real casualties. From that day, the idea of words as weapons became more than metaphor. It became legal doctrine. And from the quiet glow of a phone screen, we moved to a different battlefield entirely, where obsession no longer hides behind messages, but manifests face-to-face. Shayna Hubers and Ezra McCandless. When love turns to fixation, the line between devotion and danger can vanish in minutes. For Shayna Hubers, that boundary dissolved the moment control slipped through her hands. She was young, ambitious, and academically gifted, a psychology student who seemed to understand human behavior better than most. Ryan Poston, the attorney who became her partner, was steady and accomplished, a figure of calm against her intensity. Their relationship began with fascination but burned quickly into volatility. What began as attachment turned into argument, monitoring, and emotional dependency that friends later described as suffocating. The end of that relationship should have been simple. Ryan had decided to move on. He even planned a first date with someone new. Yet the decision ignited a chain of messages, calls, and pleas as Shayna fought to reclaim his attention. Witnesses described her repeated attempts to contact him, erratic behavior escalating into desperation. That final night, she arrived at his condominium for what she claimed was a discussion. What occurred next entered the record as homicide. Investigators found Ryan dead in his living room. Shayna called police herself, insisting she had been attacked and shot him in self-defense. The story unraveled quickly. During interrogation, her demeanor swung between remorse and unnerving humor. Officers recorded her pacing the room, occasionally dancing, and making comments about giving him the nose job he always wanted. Those moments became infamous, not for what she said, but for what her composure revealed. Kentucky Revised Statute 507020 defines murder as intentionally causing the death of another person. Prosecutors argued that every action following the shooting suggested deliberation. The scene showed no signs of struggle, no forced entry, and multiple gunshots that contradicted her claim of fear. Her defense relied on portraying Ryan as emotionally abusive, framing her as a cornered woman who reacted under duress. But the weight of forensic evidence eroded that defense. The trajectory of the bullets, the pattern of her calls before and after, and even search histories suggested forethought. Media coverage magnified her behavior in interrogation videos, calling it performative, detached. Even theatrical jurors, visibly unsettled, watched her retell events with uneven emotion, crying one moment, calm the next. In 2015, she was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Then years later, the verdict was vacated because of juror misconduct. One juror had a prior felony conviction, invalidating the entire trial. The retrial in 2018 offered her no reprieve. A new jury delivered the same outcome: guilty of murder, life without parole. The legal system corrected the technical flaw, but not the tragedy. If Shayna Hubers demonstrated volatility wrapped in intelligence, Ezra McCandless brought ambiguity wrapped in chaos. Raised in Wisconsin, she shifted identities fluidly, adapting names, gender presentation, and persona. Friends called her elusive, sometimes charming, sometimes unpredictable. By 2018, she was caught between relationships, one with a new boyfriend and another unresolved connection to Alex Woodworth, a man described as patient and introspective. That triangle would end with Alex dead in his truck on a rural property near Eau Claire. Ezra appeared at a nearby farmhouse, injured and disoriented. She told police she'd been attacked, that Alex had turned violent, and she'd defended herself. The story fractured under evidence. Forensic teams mapped the wounds and determined the attack pattern didn't align with self-defense. Investigators found inconsistencies between her injuries and her description of events. Her claim of memory loss collapsed under interrogation, as details she had forgotten resurfaced when pressed. Her demeanor in interviews, calm, measured, often referring to herself in detached terms, struck investigators as rehearsed. Prosecutors framed the killing as premeditated. They argued she lured Alex to a remote area under the pretense of reconciliation. Her defense countered that she acted out of fear and confusion. Wisconsin's statute of 94,001 required proof of intentional killing, and jurors found that threshold met. She was sentenced to life with eligibility for release after decades leaving the courtroom. Verdict was read. 2 women, 2 different states, but identical emotional cores: obsession, insecurity, and possession mistaken for love. Each used psychological complexity as both shield and weapon. Their trials exposed what happens when emotional dependency turns strategic, and as those verdicts settled, another name lingered in the archives: Camilla Gamet, convicted in Michigan for killing her boyfriend after years of conflict, her acts so deliberate that even seasoned detectives described the evidence as cruelly precise. Her story, too, belonged to the same lineage of fixation crossing into murder. These cases merged psychology and law, revealing how possessiveness and emotional instability can distort affection into fatal control. The courts measured motive through evidence, not emotion, defining where love becomes lethal. Each verdict carried its own message. The justice system can identify intent, but it cannot rewrite the moments when passion collapses into violence. Courtrooms are mirrors where passion collides with consequence. Jodi Arias rehearsed innocence, Michelle Carter weaponized language, Shayna Hubers and Ezra McCandless transformed devotion into control. Each verdict pulled back the curtain on obsession and ego, masking as love. The law can measure intent, but it cannot reconstruct what obsession destroys. Justice may convict the guilty, yet it never revives the trust, warmth, or life erased by their choices. Each ruling closes a file, but the moral questions remain. Subscribe and follow Red Tape Red Flag on all platforms. And don't forget to like, share, and comment.